Over the past 100 years, military apparel has been by far the largest influencer of men's fashion. T-shirts, field jackets, beanies, the list goes on, and the impact is undeniable. But out of all the clothes we got from the military, the most iconic, creme de la creme, certified banger is, in my opinion, the bomber jacket. Not only does it have a deep and rich action-packed history, but it also just looks sick. Now, I might be a little biased because we did just drop the solid color MCGRATH bomber jacket in stock now, but I truly think that after you watch this video, you will share my sentiments about this jacket. Without further ado, let's get to it. The turn of the 20th century brought us many technological innovations like the radio, the vacuum cleaner, and the motor vehicle, but none of them took off quite like aviation did. That being said, early aviation was really scary. There were next to no safety measures in place, specialized protective gear was non-existent, and if there was a cockpit, it was very likely open to the elements. And these elements were unforgiving. Early pilots faced dangers like hypoxia, frostbite, and even hearing loss. But fixing all that would have to wait. In 1914, war broke out across Europe, and aviation quickly became an essential part of the conflict. On both sides of the conflict, militaries scrambled to field aircraft and train pilots, and in the chaos, there was no time to develop silly liberal nonsense like specialized flight gear. When America joined World War I in 1917, they found themselves even less prepared than their allies. US pilots were mostly flying second-rate British and French aircraft, and despite an attempt at designing a flight jacket, were mostly relegated to scavenging whatever clothing they could find. For many American pilots, this meant repurposed or homemade clothing. For example, aviation cadet Carl Chapman wrote this home in 1917. "If you have any fur skins you don't want, send them over and I will have a vest or coat made from them. I can see this winter flying is going to be cold. When I go out in the morning, 5:30 now, I put on a sweater, a hair coat, and a big heavy poilu's overcoat." All this layering did keep pilots warm, but at the expense of mobility and reaction time. And in a dogfight, every second counts, so the need for specialized flight clothing was clearer now more than ever. These experiences in World War I paved the way for innovation in the 1920s. Focusing on mobility and wind resistance, the Army Air Corps spent several years refining a new flight jacket design, the Type A1. This smart-looking jacket was waist-length, tailored, and designed for mobility in cockpits becoming increasingly smaller as aviation technology advanced. The A1 had a knit wool waistband and cuffs, useful for trapping heat and blocking wind. It was also made from thick, high-quality leather and usually lined with a soft fabric like silk or cotton. And, as one style historian notes, it also created a particularly flattering fit, sitting high on the waist. With the Type A1, there was no longer any cumbersome layering required. But most importantly, there was more room and mobility in the cockpit for pilots to make the split-second decisions that could be life or death in combat. A 1920s Army pilot is quoted saying that the Type A1 fit like a windproof second skin. The flyboys were loving this shit, and it showed. While regulations stated airmen weren't supposed to wear their flight gear when they weren't actively flying, many pilots disobeyed this order and wore them out to the bar with the boys. It showed that they were members of an elite club at the tip of the spear of technological innovation. Not only that, but flight clothing was becoming something of a fashion craze at the time. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh made the first solo transatlantic flight, and after he landed, photos of him wearing a leather flight jacket were plastered in newspapers worldwide. By the next year, fans were making copies of his jacket to wear while cheering him on at sport events, and lookalikes like the A1 benefited greatly from the cult status Charles Lindbergh was achieving. At this time, bomber jackets represented daring personas, adventure, and a new frontier for humankind. Basically, pilots of the 1920s and 30s were aura farming, and everybody wanted a piece of it. But the true golden age of bomber jackets would come about 10 years later during World War II. It was a massive conflict fought in thousands of places all across the globe, and with a massive industry to back it up, the United States created about half a dozen different jackets for both air and ground crews. And while they all left their mark on American culture, 3 of them really stand out. Introducing the A2 flight jacket. Do you remember the A1? Well, this is its somehow even hotter cousin.
No, I was—
Eric! Step away from your cousin!
It was introduced shortly before World War II, and it would become the aviator's jacket of the war. The A2 was only issued once a pilot had actually earned his wings. It was a status symbol with sex appeal. Pilots, navigators, and bombardiers of the US Army Air Forces wore them in briefing rooms and cockpits all around the globe, and it quickly became a badge of honor. The jacket had a one-piece back, which was a fantastic canvas for personalization that airmen eagerly used to express themselves. During the war, it was pretty common to see an A2 bomber jacket painted with the nickname of a pilot's plane, cartoon or pinup girls, and victory marks added for each mission completed or enemy plane shot down. This customization wasn't regulation, of course, but as one veteran said, "If this guy wants to paint a naked lady on the back of his jacket, why stop him? He could be dead tomorrow." For example, Sergeant Eddie Deerfield of the 303rd Bomb Group survived multiple near-fatal missions. His A2 jacket was emblazoned with the nickname of his B-17 plus 30 bomb symbols for each of the 30 missions his crew had flown. On top of that, he also customized it with a rendition of his plane's nose art, Ease Available. That's such a funny name. Ease Available. Another airman, Lieutenant Irving Baum, became a POW after being shot down over occupied Europe. He painted an image of imprisoned Donald Duck on the back of his jacket because the prisoner of war camp where he was being held, Stalag Luft 3, had Donald Duck as its mascot. Some jackets, especially in the China, Burma, India theater, had blood chits painted on them, basically a message for locals promising rewards for helping a downed American pilot. By 1943, the A2 was on its way out in favor of new cloth jackets, but its legendary status remained and many wartime celebrities clamored to get their hands on them. To put it simply, the A2 had aura that few could ignore. But thousands of feet higher in the skies, America's bomber crews needed something a little bit cozier. Enter the B-3, basically an UGG for the upper half of your body. Crews of bomber aircraft like the B-17 or B-24 usually flew their missions between 25 and 35,000 feet. Major John Lucky Luckadoo of the 100th Bomb Group said that they contended with the 4 Fs: fighters, flak, fear, and frostbite. Shout out Major John Lucky Luckadoo, by the way, he passed away this week. The B-3 took a few notes out of World War I's playbook. It was big, bulky, well insulated. It used thick sheepskin and a ½ inch of wool to shield its wearers from harsh temperatures. Aside from changing to thicker materials, it also lost the rib knit cuffs and waist. Instead, it used a system of buckles to ensure that heat remained trapped inside the jacket. Personalization wasn't as common with B-3s as it was with A-2s, and its bulkiness made it much less attractive than its much sleeker counterpart. But it did garner a reputation as being tough and durable, something that was reinforced by propaganda newsreels of air crews pounding German factories and infrastructure. They did what to the factory? And again, its appeal reached much further than the US Army Air Corps, with George Patton being seen wearing one in 1943. While the Army flyboys had their own jackets like the B-3 and A-2, the Navy was cooking up a masterpiece. In the late 1930s, the US Navy introduced the G-1.
Hold up!
Just to clarify, during the World War II section of this, we are talking about the M422A. The G-1 designation wasn't used until 1947, but it's essentially the same jacket.
Wait a minute!
It was pretty similar to the A-2, but with a few nautical twists. Mainly, it could swallow an entire can of spinach in less than half a second. Popeye reference. The G1 sported a mouton fur collar that was meant to fold up to shield the wearer from harsh wind. It also featured a bi-swing, or gusseted back, which was very handy for naval aviators as they often dealt with cramped circumstances both in the cockpit and on ship. Wartime Navy and Marine pilots absolutely loved the G1, treating it much the same way as their Army counterparts did the A2. Many of them added patches or other customization to their G1s, but unlike the A2, it served after World War II. The G1 was issued in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, cementing its place in both civilian and military culture, but perhaps its most famous use case was in Top Gun in 1986. If you've ever wondered what jacket Tom Cruise's character is wearing in Top Gun, it's the G1. Those are the 3 big essentials of World War II bomber jackets, but the story doesn't end there. At the tail end of World War II, the Army Air Corps had begun issuing a replacement for the A2 known as the B-10. The B-10, produced in olive drab, looks very similar to the G1 but is distinguishable by its cloth fabric instead of leather. It brought back features that were popularized with the A series of jackets but lost in the early B series, like the rib knit waist and cuffs. It was also a step towards what we see in the modern day for bomber jackets, despite it being a very short-lived design. The B-10 would quickly be replaced by the B-15, which was very similar but used a new proprietary fabric called End Zone Twill. End Zone Twill was a new blend of both rayon and cotton, and that gave it a very unique appearance, being shiny on one side and dull on the other. This fabric was first proposed for military use back in 1942 because it was extremely strong and durable. At that time, it was being used mostly by football players, hence the name End Zone Twill. The B-15 really caught on in a way that many previous bomber jackets hadn't. It was so popular that jacket designs made afterwards were made as variants of the B-15 rather than a replacement. The B-15B was one such variant. It had an off-center zipper for extra drip factor and an oxygen mask retainer tab on the left breast. The B-15B was also the first bomber jacket to be made of nylon rather than End Zone Twill. Another nylon variant, the B-15C, was released shortly afterwards. It brought back the centered zipper and was also made in a color known as Midnight Blue, which went on to become an iconic look for aviators during the Korean War. The B-15C was also the jacket that Marilyn Monroe wore during a USO tour to Korea, which helped to propel it further into the civilian fashion world rather than just being a military piece. While the B-10 was very short-lived, it would trailblaze for new generations of bomber jackets that came afterwards. The evolution of the bomber jacket wasn't quite finished, however, and the MA-1 would supplant the B-15 as being the most iconic bomber jacket of all time. This is when we saw the more traditional fur collar of previous bomber jackets be replaced by knit, since fur collars were no longer needed to keep airmen warm in the latest aircraft. MA-1s would also be the first reversible bomber jacket. The interior was made of a bright orange fabric so that the airmen could turn it inside out for better visibility in the event of a crash. This is a feature that would become very popular in civilian iterations as well, like the reversible silk scorpion jacket that Ryan Gosling wears in the movie Drive. This is also the jacket that you saw everyone and their mother wearing back in 2016. The MA-1 and jackets inspired by it are arguably some of the most popular jackets of all time, mostly thanks to their appearances on the big screen. We already mentioned Drive, but bomber jackets are ever present in movies of all types. Let's go down the list real quick. Marlon Brando wears a buttoned variant in A Streetcar Named Desire. James Dean wears an iconic cherry red version in Rebel Without a Cause. In Stranger Things, Joe Keery's character Steve wears a gray bomber-style jacket like the MA-1. Steve McQueen wears one in The Hunter. The A-2 gained a lot of attention after being seen on Steve McQueen in The Great Escape. Frank Sinatra also wore an A-2 in Von Ryan's Express back in 1965. The G-1, of course, is immediately recognizable and became very popular after it was seen being worn by Tom Cruise in Top Gun. And finally, in the film The Bridges at Toko Ri, William Holden's character wears an M422A jacket, though you'd be forgiven for thinking it's a G1. Bomber jackets gained an immense amount of popularity among counterculture groups too. After World War II, many American soldiers stationed in Japan would have their bomber jackets hand-stitched with Japanese art, bringing them home as souvenirs. This gained popularity with young people in the 1950s and 60s as a symbol of rebellion and individuality. They were further established as being part of counterculture movements in the 1970s when many skinheads in England started wearing the MA-1. The rise of punk culture among disenfranchised working-class groups, especially young men, saw their gravitation towards military wear as a statement of resistance against the government. And by the 1980s, bomber jackets were making their way more into the mainstream. Nowadays, it seems like every clothing retailer has some form of bomber jacket hanging on their racks, including us. And that brings us to our iteration, the MCGRATH bomber jacket. This is our first ever original apparel item. It was released after about 3 years of development, and y'all sold it out pretty much immediately, so thank you. Our bomber jacket keeps the high-waisted look that many are famous for, with Wisconsin-made ribnet on the cuffs and on the waist. I couldn't find it, my bad. But we did change up the main outer fabric. Instead of using something like leather or nylon, we instead went with a 10-ounce cotton canvas. Why, Logan? Why would you do that? Why would we choose canvas? Well, it's durable, rugged, and it ages beautifully, unlike your mother. Shaboing! The collar also keeps the shape of traditional bomber jackets like the G1, but instead of being made of fur, it's made of corduroy. And of course, this jacket is made right here in the USA, down in Garland, Texas, in fact. As an homage to our roots as a surplus company, our first ever batch was printed in the East German Blumentarn camouflage, but as soon as we released that, people were begging for solid colors. And of course, now that we've released solid colors, they're begging for camouflage. To satiate that demand, we have pine, chalky milk, and maple. That is our contribution to the history of bomber jackets, and you can pick one up at AmericanaPipeDream.com. From open cockpit biplanes in World War I to the fur-collared bomber jackets of World War II, and finally the MA-1 worn by rebels and celebrities alike. Bomber jackets have spent the last century evolving alongside aviation itself. We should remember that these jackets weren't designed in a fashion studio. They were born out of a desperate need to keep airmen alive and shaped by the dangers of combat at 30,000 feet. They protected heroes in some of the world's greatest conflicts, and after the war became a symbol of defiance, ruggedness, and developed an impeccable aura. That's all I got for you today. If you liked the video, drop a like.